Happy New Year, everyone, and Merry Christmas. It is still Christmas. Christmas is more than one day. It is 12 days long. And of course, happy recovery from COVID, which, if you are like me and most other people I know, you got over Christmas and are now recovering from. Yes, the Knowles family, like so many of you, celebrated Christmas and the New Year with a full-blown case of the Rona, which frankly was perfectly fine in my opinion, because it gave all Americans one of the greatest Christmas presents of all. As COVID spread through the country like wildfire among the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, conservative and liberal alike, the liberal establishment completely changed its story on the virus and the vaccines and even the masks. It turns out that we conservatives, we skeptics, we ordinary normal people were completely right about everything. And they, the libs and the establishmentarians and all the rest of them, were completely wrong about everything. And we are finally being vindicated in 2022 for something that we knew all the way back in 2020, before 2 years of 15 days to slow the spread. Fa la 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 la, la la, la la. I'm Michael Knowles. This is The Michael Knowles Show. Welcome back to the show. My favorite comment from our last episode, what was that? A week ago, 2 weeks ago, from YazGirl7 says, I shared your shows on my Facebook and they have restricted my account, saying that fact checkers said the info I was sharing is false. I'm so mad. The media is so full of lies and I have to listen to shows like yours to get the truth. Well, it's very kind. Thank you for listening to the show to get the truth. I'm sorry that your Facebook account was restricted because you shared my shows, which said true things and not false things. But the silver lining here, the good news is that because the establishment has completely changed its tune on COVID, on the vax, on the virus, on the masks, on the mitigation efforts, on just the whole thing, and now they agree with me and what I've been saying for 2 years, maybe you'll get your Facebook account back. But more likely, probably not, because the ruling class really has no integrity whatsoever. I had COVID. I had it. I know a lot, not all of you had COVID, but I had it. I had the real COVID. We had a test. The test was positive. It was the real deal. I now am fully convinced, as a result of getting COVID again and this test, that what I had 2 years ago before we had tests was also COVID, because it was the same thing, except this time it was a little more mild. The symptoms of COVID, as reported in Yahoo News, this is from a study from Norway. They said the symptoms of COVID, the most common symptoms, are cough, runny or stuffy nose, fatigue and lethargy, sore throat, headache, and fever. And then, to a lesser degree, reduced taste and reduced smell. Meaning that the symptoms of COVID are the symptoms of the common cold or the flu, as we've been saying from the beginning. I don't totally want to undersell it. It was worse than a lot of colds I've had. And some people had it worse than other people. I had it worse than some of my other friends. I've said on this show now for months, I don't think it's a good idea to publicize one's vaccine status, because we are living in a biomedical security state where you can lose your entire life and livelihood if you don't go along with whatever the whims of the ruling class are on the vaccines. So I don't think it's a good idea for you or anyone else to publicize that you haven't had the vaccine or you have had the vaccine or you got 17 boosters or whatever. All I will tell you is my whole family had COVID over the break. A number of my friends all around the country had COVID over the break. Some of those people were not vaccinated. Some of those people were vaccinated. Some of those people are super duper COVID crazy and had the boosters and are as gung-ho on the Fauci advice as they could possibly be. And I'm just speaking anecdotally. There was no rhyme or reason to who got COVID. There was no rhyme or reason to who got it more severely or less severely. Some people who were not vaccinated got COVID the mildest of all. Some people who were vaccinated and boosted got COVID really, really bad. We were also told that children and babies don't deal with COVID as terribly as adults do? I'll tell you just anecdotally, little baby Knowles, my son, apple of my eye, 11 months old, he had it worse than any of us did. And so I'm not merely saying that we were right about everything and that the fearmongers were wrong about everything. I'm also pointing out that the elite ruling class who have told us they know the science and they're following all the science and we have to trust them, they have no idea what they're talking about. And the things that they told us about the virus, the things they told us about the vaccines, the things they told us about the masks and the mitigation efforts, they were just wrong. They were just bunk. And now they are admitting it. The only reason that I hope this episode of the show doesn't get taken off of the internet is because I am now agreeing with the ruling class and the media and the public health experts and the politicians who just so happen to have adopted the things that I've been saying for 2 years, where I have at various times been censored, like that lady in the comments earlier said, that sometimes the shows will be taken off of YouTube. I want to point out what I'm describing is just an anecdote, right? My experience of COVID, my family, my friends. But the plural of anecdote is data. Okay, you get enough anecdotes, and then you've got data. And what we are seeing, even the ruling class say now, is that the reality of this virus is very different than they told us it would be. The libs used to tell us, when they first sold us on the vaccines, they told us that the vaccines were going to stop you from contracting the virus or transmitting the virus.
There's been over a 20-to-1 return.
If you had put that money into an S&P 500 and reinvested the dividends, you'd come up with something like $17 billion, but you think it's $200 billion.
Here, yeah.
You're okay. You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
These vaccines are highly, highly effective.
Vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick.
They're really, really good against variants.
Everyone who takes the vaccine is not just protecting themselves, but reducing their transmission to other people and allowing society to get back to normal.
Get your first shot, and when you're due for your second, get your second shot.
Our key goal is to stop the transmission, to get the immunity levels up so that you get almost no infection going on whatsoever.
When people are vaccinated, they can feel safe that they are not going to get infected.
So you heard it from the horse's mouth, or maybe some other part of the horse. What they said is, if you get the vaccines, you won't contract the virus. You won't get it. If you get the vaccines, you won't transmit the virus. The vaccines are really, really good against variants. None of that is true. We know that's false. We know that's false in part because we have our own eyes and our own ears and our own bodies, and people have gotten infected, even if they have been vaccinated in a lot of cases. But we also know it's the case now because even those people, all those same people who are peddling those lies, admit that it's not true.
What they can't do anymore is prevent transmission.
We didn't have vaccines that block transmission. We got vaccines that help you with your health, but they only slightly reduce the transmission. So we need a new way of doing the vaccine.
The level of virus in the nasopharynx of a person who's vaccinated and infected is the same level as the level of virus in the nasopharynx of an unvaccinated person.
Reports from our international colleagues, including Israel, suggest increased risk of severe disease amongst those vaccinated early.
And if you look at Israel, which has always been a month to a month and a half ahead of us, they are seeing a waning of immunity, not only against infection, but against hospitalizations and to some extent death. A booster might actually be an essential part of the primary regimen that people should have.
So you get the idea. It goes on and on. None of the things they originally told us turned out to be true about the vaccines. Now, do not let them get away with this. Do not let them tell you, as some people are now insisting, as a lot of people are now insisting, that the purpose of vaccines is not to prevent infection or transmission. The purpose of vaccines is just to mitigate certain symptoms of a virus or a disease. That isn't true. They're just changing the definition of a vaccine. You don't get the polio vaccine so that you get milder symptoms of polio. You don't get the hepatitis vaccine so that you get just a slightly weaker form of hepatitis. You get these vaccines to prevent you from being infected in the first place. And that's exactly what they promised us the COVID vaccines would do. And you heard it. Don't accuse me of misinformation, Facebook or YouTube or whatever. You heard it from the very people, the very public health experts, who then changed their story and relieved themselves on our legs and decided to tell us that it's raining. This is why. I know some people have this idea still, that the vaccines are the greatest thing ever invented, and they're just so impressive, and they're just so wonderful, and everyone's got to get them. Okay, let's say that's all true. Let's just give you that for a second. It is simply a fact that the vaccines don't do what they told us they would do, which is why the people pushing this stuff have no credibility, because they were wrong. That's not our fault. That's not the fault of the skeptics, and that's not the fault of the people who are spreading information around YouTube. It's their fault. They got it wrong, so they don't have credibility, and people are absolutely 100% justified in not believing what these craven, lying, deceptive, dishonest incompetents tell us. A U.S. Navy warship is being held right now off of the coast of South America. It's it's being held off the coast of America and not deploying to South America because of an outbreak of COVID. There's an outbreak of COVID on the USS Milwaukee. It is not deploying because there's an outbreak among a 100% vaccinated crew. Crew totally 100. You have to get vaccinated over your medical objections, over your religious objections, especially if you're in the military. Tough. You're not getting an exemption. You have to get vaccinated. That's because we need a fighting force that's ready to deploy, except we can't because even with a 100% vaccinated crew, there's still an outbreak of COVID. If there are debilitating outbreaks that prevent ships from fulfilling their mission, even with 100% vaccination, then the vaccines are not doing their job, period. And the ruling class knows it, and so they're giving up the narrative now. Joe Biden comes out, and he's changing his tune. Do you remember when he was running for president? It's hard to say he even ran for president because he mostly hid in his basement for the whole time and just waited for corrupt election officials in his crony states to change the rules to make it easier for him to win. But he, in some way, he did a few campaign events at least, and he went out there. What did he say? He said, "I've got a federal plan. And I, as president, am going to shut down the virus.
I'll put in place a plan to deal with this pandemic responsibly. I've already done it. I've said it before. I'm not going to shut down the economy. I'm not going to shut down the country, but I'm going to shut down the virus. I've said it before. I'm not going to shut down the economy. I'm not going to shut down the country. I'm going to shut down the virus. What I would say is I'm going to shut down the virus, not the country. I'm not going to shut down the country. I'm going to shut down the virus."
All right, that's enough. You could go on for probably 15 minutes because Joe Biden, he knows not very many things, but he sticks to what he knows. All right, we've got a federal plan. Trump didn't shut down the virus. We're going to shut down the virus when I'm president. That was then, this is now, and now he's not going to shut down the virus.
Look, there is no federal solution. This gets solved at a state level.
Okay. There's no federal solution. He's not going to shut down the virus. If you want the virus to be shut down, it's going to happen at the state level. There is nothing the federal government can do, according to Joe Biden. All right, better late than never. Except that it's so cynical. It's so opportunistic. This was always true. There was never going to be any solution. It was always true. Now we have CNN's medical analyst saying that the cloth masks don't work. The cloth masks never worked. Well, the cloth masks aren't going to stop an airborne virus. Right, we knew the virus was airborne. They were the CNN medical analyst, Leanna Wu, says that the cloth masks are nothing but facial decorations. Yeah, that was always true. We always knew that. So why are they admitting it now? The vaccines don't prevent infection or transmission. All of the public health officials now admit that. But it was always true. So why are they admitting it now? There's no federal solution to shut down the virus. That was always true. Why are they admitting it now? They're admitting it now. I actually have an answer to this. Some people seem really flummoxed, even on the right. They say, why? What's going on? I don't get it. I get it. Here's why. Because the ruling class has already gotten what it wanted out of COVID. It already got what it wanted out of making everyone wear the masks and forcing everyone to comply with the vaccine mandates and shutting down the society and taking power. They already got that. The public health establishment already got the power. We've already reordered the relationship between the citizen and the state. The vaccine mandates are going into effect. The regulatory state and the citizen and private employers, now there's a new balance of power there. It's much more on the side of the government. There's already been a massive transfer of wealth, the largest transfer of wealth in human history, from the lower classes to the upper class. Shutting down of small businesses, lots more power and money to big businesses. That already happened. The power grab at the governmental and corporate level has already taken place over these very long 2 weeks to slow the spread, the 2 weeks that turned into 2 years. So they got it. So you don't really need to keep it up anymore. That's done. Now the COVID lockdown state is having diminishing political returns for the ruling class. This was always the one issue that Biden was ahead on. He was losing on the economy, he was losing on foreign policy, he was losing on oil, he was losing on manufacturing, he was losing on everything except for COVID. That was the one area where his approval rating was a little bit higher. But now that's tanked too. And so this is a big loser for them. There's really nowhere else to go. They've already taken the power. So they move on. And their puppets in the corporate media are dutifully doing their part to downplay the virus. Chris Hayes on MSNBC now says that COVID, why, by golly, it's just like the flu.
There are still people, many people, millions, who are immunocompromised or who are otherwise vulnerable due to age or medical conditions. But for the people who don't fall into that category, and we're talking about, 150 million people maybe or more, those people who are vaccinated, particularly those who are boosted, the personal risk of being exposed to this went from something that we hadn't really dealt with specifically like this before in our lifetimes. We hadn't quite had an illness this infectious and this possible to cause serious illness to something that does look more like the flu. And the flu, of course, can still be dangerous, kills tens of thousands of Americans every year, but we don't orient our lives around the flu. So that's closer to the level of risk that, 200 million Americans or less than that are now dealing with. And then when you add in the sheer exhaustion many people feel, and I don't have to tell you this, I'm sure, because you're just feeling this yourself, many of you, with the lengths of this disruption in their lives, obviously the politics of the pandemic are just completely different than they were earlier in the pandemic.
Okay, there's the key. There is the key. The first thing he said is interesting too, but that second part is the real key. He says, and look, obviously, beyond the scientific stuff, politically, you just can't keep this up forever. Okay, so you're admitting that the way policy is being made on COVID is primarily not scientific, but primarily political. And you're really seeing that now from Dr. Fauci, which we'll get to in 1 second. But what about that first part? The first part, he says, is, look, the thing is we're just going to have to live with COVID, and COVID, now is just kind of like, it's a lot like the flu. Do you remember? I'm old enough to remember. I know it was a long time ago, but I'm old enough to remember when some of us said that 2 years ago. Said in a lot of ways, this virus is like the flu. We called it the Wu flu, the Wuhan flu. Maybe it's a little deadlier, maybe, although, you got to look into these statistics. But sure, let's say it's deadly. Let's say it's significantly deadlier. Let's say that it's going to have a really tough run for a couple of years before the virulence of the virus diminishes and it becomes less of a pandemic, a global, raging pandemic, and more of just an endemic thing that we deal with every single year. We're just going to live with it. We're not going to overcome it by shutting down society or wearing those dumb masks or anything. That's not going to stop it. We're not going to shut down the virus by shutting down society. Remember when we said all that? We said it's kind of like the flu. And we were accused of being spreaders of misinformation, of being murderers, of killing people. We were accused of being rubes and idiots and willfully ignorant. And now the liberal establishment is saying everything that we said then. And they're trying to cover their derrieres a little bit. So they're saying, well, no, but it's true now. That's true now, but it wasn't true then. No, it was true. It was true then too. Because all the stuff you did to try to stop the virus and to stop transmission and to stop infection, and it didn't work. It didn't really work, did it? And even Joe Biden's admitting that. Even Joe Biden is admitting there's just There's just no national solution to this. So yes, we were right from the very beginning. And now the response is primarily political. And they're saying we can't really keep this up anymore. We're having diminishing political returns, so we're just going to move on. And now you got to get back to work. Okay, that's what we're really being told. You've got to get back to work. The CDC formerly told us that when you get COVID, you need to quarantine for how long? About 10 days, maybe longer, but at least 10 days you've got to quarantine. Now they are saying that if you get COVID, you need to quarantine for 5 days. Now, I Googled, I looked up on Google Scholar, I tried to find the scientific reasoning for why they reduced the time from 10 days to 5 days. You won't find the scientific reasoning. The scientific reasoning is not there. There's nothing about the science that has changed from when they told us it should be a 10-day quarantine to a 5-day quarantine. What changed is the politics. A lot of people are getting COVID. Many of you had it over Christmas. And so you all got to get back to work. We got to keep making money for that ruling class. Get back out there, folks. We actually do have some more work coming on here at the Daily Wire. We have a new series. It's called Face the Mob. Face the Mob. You know, we back in the pre-COVID days, in the days before everything went to pot, I would go to a ton of schools every year and just engage with people, the sort of angry crowds, and they would yell at me, and then we would have an exchange, and we'd post these clips online. So since that's much more difficult to do now, and since a lot of constructive debate doesn't usually happen in 280 characters on Twitter, we decided to face the mob digitally. So that's out there now. First episode of that is up on YouTube. You can go check it out on my YouTube channel. It's a lot of fun to talk to people, some of whom agreed with me, many of whom disagreed with me. So go check that out. Also, Do Not Comply has taken on an entirely new meeting for the Daily Wire this week. This Friday, the Supreme Court will convene to hear arguments on the legality and constitutionality of the vax mandate. That means that this week is going to be pivotal in our fight against the Biden administration's vaccine mandate. We've got over 1 million signatures on our Do Not Comply petition currently. It's vital that the number increases before Friday. When you sign the petition at dailywire.com/do not comply, you help us send the message that the American people will not comply. So go to dailywire.com/do not comply right now. We're counting on your help to help us put a stop to this disgusting, horrible, un-American, tyrannical federal overreach. The CDC has changed its mind again just in time for you to get off the couch and get back to work and start making us some money. Darn it. Rochelle Walensky, the head of the CDC, goes on CNN, says, cut that quarantine time in half and start bringing in those dollars for Big Daddy.
I want to start with the change in the CDC guidance that cuts the isolation period in half if you're asymptomatic. So how did the CDC settle on 5 days for everyone?
Good morning, Caitlin. Thanks for having me. So we looked at several areas of science here. First, the science of how much transmission happens in the period of time after you're infected. We know that the most amount of transmission occurs in those 1 to 2 days before you develop symptoms, those 2 to 3 days after you develop symptoms. And if you map that out, those 5 days account for somewhere between 85 to 90% of all transmission that occurs. And then finally, the behavioral science. What will people actually do when people need to get back to work? What is it that they will actually do? And if we can get them to isolate, we do want to make sure that they're isolating in those first 5 days when they're maximally infectious.
So from what you're saying, it sounds like this decision had just as much to do with business as it did with the science.
Well, so it really had a lot to do with what we thought people would be able to tolerate.
Even CNN is onto the game. Even, you see, because they always lead with the science, and they say, well, actually, you know, what we've learned is that you're more likely to spread a virus in the early days of getting it than in the later days. Yeah, duh. That, of course. That's true of every virus. That's always been true. Yeah, and so we just decided we were going to cut the time in half. And then even CNN, you know, can't keep a straight face, and they say, so this is just politics, right? This is just because you want to make more money that you're telling people to, and then she admits it. Rochelle Walensky admits it. She says, yeah, this is about what people will tolerate and what they're going to do. So, in other words, this is primarily about politics. This always has been primarily about politics, and they're finally admitting it. even Dr. Fauci is admitting it. Dr. Fauci goes on TV, his favorite place to be, most dangerous place in the world, is not in a COVID hotspot. It's the space between Dr. Fauci and a television camera. Dr. Fauci goes on and he says, yeah, just get back to work.
The purpose of it is that given the wave, the extraordinary, unprecedented wave of infections that we are experiencing now and will certainly experience more of in the next few weeks, that there is the danger that there will be so many people who are being isolated, who are asymptomatic for the full 10 days, that you could have a major negative impact on our ability to keep society running. So the decision was made, although it's not completely risk-free, of saying, let's get that cut in half so that we could have 50%, namely half of the 10 days, and 50% of that time, people can actually be out with a mask in society.
This weasel, listen to his language. The decision was made. The decision was made? By whom was the decision made, Doctor? The decision, it was said by whom, you jerk? It's you. You did it. You guys did it. You cut it in half. But why? Because the science changed? No, we decided Mr. Bezos needed a little more money. We did not want you disgusting peasant workers to slack on your job. And we realized that if you all stayed home when you were sick, that we wouldn't be able to make as much money for the plutocratic ruling elite. So it was decided by the science that you would have to go back to work. Okay, all right, you get the picture. You get the picture. They're barely hiding it at all now. Speaking of work, AOC took a little vacation, and she's in hot trouble because of it. AOC went down. She left the tyrannical state of New York, her own state, and she went down to the free state of Florida. Good old DeSantis land, where you can do what you want and breathe the fresh air and have a nice time. So she goes down to Florida while her constituents are dealing with a spike in COVID and spike in crime because of the bad policies that AOC in part is supporting, and a spike in all sorts of misery in New York. I did go to New York briefly over Christmas. Not looking great. The city has seen better days, let's put it that way. So she abandons them. She goes to Florida on vacation. I don't really begrudge her vacation, but it's a bad look. If you're going to make fun of Ted Cruz for going to Mexico, and you're going to castigate him and yell at him over that, then what's good for the goose is good for the gander, AOC. And AOC was leading that charge, screaming at Ted Cruz because he went to a sunny place, as there were problems in his own state. And well, AOC did exactly the same thing, and so she got caught, and she's a big old hypocrite, as we all know. And her response was so typical. She said the only reason people were criticizing her is because they want to date her. That Republican men really want to date her, and she won't date them, and so they're criticizing her. I saw someone on Twitter over the weekend asked if you had this choice, would you rather date AOC or be banished to St. Helena? That's the island that they banished Napoleon to, and that I suggest we banish Dr. Fauci to. Which would you rather be banished to a far-flung island or date AOC? And it was observed by some people that you're only going to get peace and quiet in one of those situations. So choose carefully. Here's AOC's exact words, quote, "If Republicans are mad they can't date me, they can just say that instead of projecting their sexual frustrations onto my boyfriend's feet, you creepy weirdos. It's starting to get old ignoring the very obvious, strange, and deranged sexual frustrations that underpin the Republican fixation on me, women, and LGBT plus people in general." Hold on, the sexual frustrations. So, if you're critical of AOC, it's because you want to date her. And if you're critical of, say, the LGBT movement, it's because you want to date the dudes. So you must be very sexually confused. If you want to date the transsexuals and the homosexuals and AOC. You want to date all these people. You can't make up your mind, and none of your criticisms are legitimate. She says these people clearly need therapy. They won't do it, and they use politics as their outlet instead. It's really weird. And this is the same sort of thing that AOC said about the fake insurrection on January 6th, the worst, the greatest threat ever against America, ever in history. She said that she was almost raped on January 6th. She was almost raped by the insurrectionists. And then we found out, actually, she wasn't even in the Capitol. She was in her office building, which was a considerable distance from the Capitol. And the insurrectionists, quote unquote, didn't get anywhere near her office. Actually, it was just a cop who was showing up there just to make sure she was safe, just to protect her. And the thought that she was about to be raped was entirely in her own delusion. It was entirely in her own head. This woman, I want to be really polite about this. I don't want to be rude. This woman has an extremely inflated sense of her own attractiveness. She is not. I don't know, man. I'm just speaking for myself. I don't want to date AOC. I do not now, nor have I ever wanted to date AOC. I don't know any Republican who wants to date AOC. I don't want to be rude and say mean things about a woman's appearance or personality, but lady, she needs a reality check. And I suppose that's true in many areas, philosophically, ideologically, politically. The reason that her comment is interesting is not because of just how juvenile it is and how divorced from reality it is, but because it actually is part of the kind of broader left-wing reaction to conservative criticism, which is to reject the legitimacy of any criticism of their political agenda and to pathologize all of it. The left always dismisses conservative criticism of their agenda as the result of some usually sexual mental illness, some kind of pathology. Lionel Trilling said this back in the 20th century. He said that there is no conservative intellectual movement in America. It's just a series of irritable mental gestures. The reason conservatives perhaps object to redefining marriage or our sexual ethic is not because they recognize that the human body has a nature, that our soul and our body have something to do with one another, that the body has a purpose, and that there is a fundamental political building block of society such as the family. We could go on and on and on. It's not because of any reasonable arguments. It's because they're phobes. They're haters. They're ists, the sexists and the racists and the phobes, and that's why it's all irrational. And so what they need is not a vigorous debate to determine how we want to proceed as a society. What they need is not deliberation and persuasion. What they need is therapy. What they need is to go be put on some drugs, or what they need is to go just be brainwashed. They need to be ostracized from